yeshiva this year and the program have been more motivated, more driven, more excited about what we're doing than in the entire, I've been here, this is my 17th year, or I just finished my 16th year here, and I can say unequivocally that this year was the most driven, the most focused, and the students were really a pleasure to work with. And so this is a great platform to build on, and Golan, who is well known far outside of these walls for his cybersecurity expertise and IT expertise, presumably. I don't even know fully the whole story, but I know that every time I hear a little piece of it, it becomes more and more fascinating. I am proud to say that I have a friend who once shut down the entire telephones network of the Netherlands. I don't think that everybody in the world can say that, and I don't know the full story of that either, and I'm not sure that's what the presentation
We'll leave it to the Q&A.
We'll leave it to the Q&A. Exactly. But in any case, it's our honor and privilege to introduce Golan Ben-Oni.
Well, I guess I should start by saying that for me, this really started as a hobby. And essentially, cybersecurity practitioners are driving at one general question, which is, you know, how does this thing work? And how do we prevent other individuals, other parties, from exploiting the things that we're responsible for? And one thing that I discovered sort of when I asked myself this question is it easier to get into a system, or is it easier to protect? And I think it's pretty clear that for anybody who's worked in cybersecurity and has maybe even just studied cybersecurity, when it comes to things like pen testing, what we're working on is identifying a risk or a hole in the environment through which we will either report on or exploit and report on for the purpose of hopefully fixing. And when I was a student, we simply didn't have the universities, we didn't have the laboratories, we didn't have the low-cost computing systems that were readily available really to anybody, to leverage. And therefore, for some of us during this period of time, the world became our laboratory, okay, for right or for wrong. But you guys are in a very, very unique situation right now, which is to say that all the things that I would have loved to have had, maybe at your age or maybe younger, are out there, okay? And really the only thing that we need to be successful in this industry is an interest and a dedication, to really spending time on solving the problem. And beyond that, it's something that we really need as a country. It's something that we really need as an organization. Every time I hear about it in the news, it's discussed in terms of the number of open positions. And sometimes you'll hear that in the United States there might be as many as 1 million open positions in cybersecurity. Worldwide, it may be as many as 3 million. I don't really think anyone knows, but the bottom line is that this is a very desired industry to be part of, okay? And that's exciting also, because if you plan on making, kind of a role or a job in this field, rest assured there's something out there for you, okay? And it's not to say that there aren't jobs in other areas of IT, but this is one that's here to stay, and I honestly believe that we're just at the beginning of it, for many of the reasons that we've heard, largely having to do with the fact that the systems that we mostly use today haven't really been designed with security in mind. And that basically means that until people take security seriously, and they take it as a foundational requirement for any of the systems and services that we use, there's always going to be some loophole. And even if we do build it with security in mind, there's no guarantee that there won't be a problem, right? So I had a very unique opportunity about a week or so ago to sit down with General Hayden. And some of you may know him, but he had a very illustrious career, working for a number of government agencies, four-star general, NSA, CIA, and so on. And it'd probably be safe to say that he really understands cybersecurity as it relates, to kind of the United States and internationally. And because it was a 2-hour conversation, I'm not going to go into, all the details, but I did want to provide some highlights, and I think it's important because this came right from the top. So here's just a quote, which I want to read, which states that the next president is going to inherit the most sophisticated and persistent cyber espionage culture than the world has ever seen. He or she needs to surround himself with experts that can expedite the allocation of potent layers of next generation defenses around our targeted, and he's only talking about critical infrastructure, but the reality is that it's all of our infrastructure, right? So I'm only going to really touch on 2 general challenges in cybersecurity. There's one way to look at it. We have a combination of internal threats and external threats, right? What are internal threats? Well, the agencies themselves are dealing with a slew of internal threats. There's really not a lot of information that's been publicly released. But everybody knows that internal threats are one of the biggest problems that an organization faces, okay? And I want to talk about that first. So, when you're an agency, it might even be a law enforcement agency, but here, we're really talking about intelligence agencies. There is, a threat, an insider threat of double agents and foreign intelligence officers sort of getting into your environment. And who better to kind of figure out the state of affairs and to leak information than an insider, right? An insider has direct access very often to the programs they're read into, and maybe they even have access to programs they've not been read into, which was a problem with Snowden, which we can talk about in a minute. But ultimately, we've heard this word data leakage. Well, once you've acquired information, if you want to pass it along, that's known as data leakage, and whether you're doing it with a software program or whether you're doing it word of mouth or taking photographs or audio recordings, that is all data leakage. And what is it we're leaking? Well, we could call it intellectual property theft. That's sort of the things that we've really thought about, intellectually produced. If you're a defense contractor and you're building airplanes or fighter jets, intellectual property theft might be about the F-35 fighter jet, right? Or it might be about the Boeing aircraft, okay? And we really don't want that information to leak, not only because we don't want other defense contractors building it with our intellectual property, but because we don't want our enemies using our technology against us. And this, in fact, has happened, and it's happened numerous times. Recently, about a year ago, a shadowy group of individuals known as the shadow brokers got a hold of the NSA tools that the NSA themselves developed and deployed against other countries for the purpose of gaining access to foreign networks, okay? That leaked. And the problem with that isn't only that foreign governments, now have access to our tools, but anybody has access to them. So the problem here is that some of the best developed tools, just imagine that an F-35 fighter jet got into the hands of a 15-year-old. Okay, what kind of havoc that would wreak? Well, in cybersecurity, that's kind of what happened, because anybody on the internet who sort of can find these tools can gain access to do things that formerly only the federal government or the U.S. government was able to do, and that's very scary. Okay. So aside from internal threats, of course we have external threats, and it very often starts with an internal threat and then it becomes an external threat, but external threats can appear on the scene on their own, and sometimes they are state-sponsored actors, which are other governments that are either in a tit-for-tat war with us or just trying to gather intelligence. Sometimes they're criminal actors, and there are other kinds of actors that are trying to get access to your organization, okay? And there are other kinds of external threats, but I just want to focus on those. So General Hayden spent a long time sort of talking about the state of affairs with other countries. And the federal government believes although he didn't state it directly, that China is an example of a country that we need to worry about, okay? Now, I must just make this little point, which is that he was not saying China is our enemy, okay? In fact, he went out of his way to say that China is not, in fact, our enemy. But I brought this issue up, which is the China 2025 plan, okay? Now, this is a publicly available plan. You can read about it. The Chinese are very transparent about it. And what the China 2025 plan essentially does is it creates a set of goals by which China will attempt to achieve dominance in 10 of the industries that the United States are, basically leaders in, and they've already managed, to gain dominance in some of them. But they include things like the rails. They include things like certain rare earth metals that are used in manufacturing all the devices that we use. Include things like the aerospace industry, nanotechnology, quantum computing. Okay, these are sort of areas that are highly disruptive for which the United States traditionally has been a leader in. Okay, now what do you think will happen when China dominates those 10 industries? Well, it'll be a very different playing field, let's put it that way. And they are sort of transparent about what they're trying to do, okay? Now, whether or not that makes them a foe is largely determined by how they go about it. So China, for the longest time, has been accused of, programs where they're essentially out there trying to gain insider information, trying to get information from external threats, but essentially trying to gain intellectual property so that they can shortcut the process of building their defense, industrial base, their airplanes, and so on and so forth. But China has evolved beyond beyond a country that is only managing to do what they do because of intellectual property theft. They have some of the smartest people in the world. Okay, and if you look at their the way that they've adopted the internet, I mean this was a closed country, right? So a closed country can say internet, no. But they've managed to adopt technologies in a way that is very unique. And China is not saying to their people, this is a threat to our government. They're trying to figure out a way to leverage the technologies that are out there so that they can do their own development. And the speed to which that they have been able to achieve that has been helped by some of the intellectual property theft that they have been involved with. But let's not fool ourselves, okay? They're going to their own universities, okay? And they are developing their own capabilities in terms of, developing technologies on their own, okay? Now, there's a couple things about China in terms of the way that they've traditionally acted. And when it comes, time to talk about the way that they've acted in cybersecurity, as opposed to some of the other governments like Russia, when they go after something, they don't hide the fact that they're doing it. Okay, they break a lot of glass, they make a lot of noise, and at the end of the day, they just deny it, and what are you going to do about it? Okay, so in 2015, the Obama administration spent a lot of time trying to negotiate new rules of engagement with China, and they sort of agreed, we're not going to attack you, you're not going to attack us, and we'll try to back off before this thing gets out of hand. But as much as we've been accusing China about stealing intellectual property and breaking into networks, the fact of the matter is the United States perhaps was the biggest of this, okay? So it's kind of hard to ask someone not to do something if you do it yourself. And as a matter of fact, we typically do this even with friends because we have this thing called trust but verify, which is I trust you and I trust what you're saying to me, but I'm going to verify what you're saying is correct, okay? Okay, so this is China. Now, Russia is another interesting, country, in part because they don't really even eat at the same table as the United States does. Okay, they're not a superpower like the United States is, and because of that, rather than trying to advance to the level that the United States is advanced to, what they're trying to do is to lower the legs of the table by which the United States eats at, in hopes that at some point they'll be able to scoot their chair in and join us, okay? And they've done all sorts of interesting things, okay? So if you think about it, what are they doing? Well, they know, in every country you've got a right and a left, okay? And they're not the cause of the right and the left. That's sort of a natural thing. But what they've attempted to do, and they've largely been successful, is to kind of disrupt the republic, okay, by getting the right and the left to become even more polarized. And this was made obvious by the fact that they invested as little as $100,000 in Facebook and Twitter ads, okay, sort of getting the left excited at the right and the right excited at the left. And all of a sudden there are demonstrations and marches. It's just incredible what you can do with social media advertising. And it turns out Russia was behind a lot of it. We don't hear about all of it because the media likes to talk about the left more than they like to talk about the right, but they were just as active on both sides of this equation. Okay, so Putin actually has been very successful in causing disruption not only to the political situation, but also even the very fabric of our democracy, which is our voting platform. Okay, now the intelligence agencies during the last administration essentially told Obama that they don't believe that the next election will be decided by Russia. In other words, with all the disruption and all the noise, it still hasn't been enough, to kind of get another person into office. Okay, but this is continuing to be in the news today. Did Russia get Obama and Clinton out, and did they bring in this current president? Anyhow, so that's Russia. Okay. Now, there's another couple of advocates here, of adversaries here, Iran and North Korea, and each of them have actually developed highly capable cybersecurity offense teams. And here at IDT, I can say that we actually monitored some of this because we were targeted. Now, the process of identifying who's attacking you in cybersecurity is known as attribution. And very oftentimes, attribution is wrong. It's very easy to make it look like somebody, okay? And it takes a lot of work and data intelligence gathering to determine if, in fact, the people that you believe have attacked you, in fact, did attack you. But in 2009, we saw some activity at IDT from Iran that was actually quite shocking. We knew about capabilities, of the United States and some of our friendly nations, but we did not know just how advanced the Iranians had become. Okay, in the axes of the world, you sort of have, the NATO countries, right? And then you have the non-NATO countries. You've got, Iran and China and Russia, right? Sort of also in another category, and North Korea in another category, Venezuela in another category, and then, you've got the United States and the UK and Australia and France and Germany and, in another category. And so if you have somebody in your group that you want to educate, you educate them, and you educate them with the best. And it was our belief that in 2009, the Iranians largely gained their skills from Russia. Okay, it's not really known, but that's kind of what we think. And similarly, North Korea either developed this on their own or they learned about it, from one of their friends. Okay, but the point is that each of them have developed highly capable cybersecurity offense teams. And we've seen some of the activity from North Korea in Europe actually not too long ago. The NATO countries were targeted. The United States was targeted by an attack named WannaCry that was largely attributed, to North Korea. Whether it's true or not, we may never know, but that's kind of the thought process. Okay. Now, why are they doing this? Well, because they're isolated, they attempt to enter the game through the internet, right? Because on the internet, sort of everybody is at a level playing field. If you're on the internet, you can reach anyone else on the internet. It doesn't really matter where you are physically. So if you're physically isolated, but you have an internet connection, hey, you've got access to the world, right? So this is one of the reasons they're doing it. And cybersecurity has gotten to the point where, connected networks it's like a bad neighborhood, the internet. And even networks that we don't believe are connected to the internet somehow get connected to the internet, or a USB key is connected to a machine that's on the internet, and somehow that gets into your environment, and something that came from the internet enters your environment. Okay, this is one of the tactics that the U.S. and Israel developed when they were trying to take out the Iranian, nuclear program. Okay, so they had essentially a network that was offline. It was not connected to the internet, but yet they knew that between the contractors and the employees that worked there, that somehow they would be successful in getting some code into the environment, you know, and eventually that code did in fact make it into the environment, and you know, the rest is history. They developed such a successful cybersecurity attack that, you know, essentially destroyed the centrifuges that were used to enrich, you know, uranium. So I'm not going to get into that attack vector because there's a lot to talk about, but that's kind of the point. So you can ask the question, what are we doing wrong, right? What is it that we could be doing better? Because clearly our adversaries have leapfrogged us, and you know, if it isn't obvious to you already, just open up the newspapers. I mean, you know, you're talking about organizations that are spending millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars in cybersecurity, but yet they're still on the front page of the New York Times. So what's going on here, okay? And at the same time, if you take a look at what's going on in the United States, it's pretty clear that there's become sort of, in addition to this polarization problem, there's been a fragmentation of government intelligence and law enforcement. And there's been a significant loss of trust, both against the private sector organizations, in particular Facebook and Google recently. You know, PII, which we characterize as private information, largely no one cared about on Facebook until relatively recently, and all of a sudden it's a big problem because that information was leveraged potentially to get the next president into office, and the people that don't like that president made a big deal about it. But let's face it, the same thing was done with the president before him, and that wasn't a big deal. But right now, there is a loss of trust against the private sector organizations, and that has been a growing issue in the US, but in Europe, that has been going on for a long time, okay? But there's also been a loss of trust in government organizations, particularly the NSA, CIA, and FBI. And when Snowden kind of made his foray into public view, he disclosed a lot of information about the NSA collection programs. And even to this day, we don't really know how deep the NSA was collecting information. There are some very interesting YouTube videos, which I recommend you watch. One by Bruce Schneier, who gave a talk at MIT about just some of the programs that the NSA was involved with that were cited by Edward Snowden, okay? But that really harmed the NSA, but both in terms of their view, you know, by the general public, but it even impacted their data collection programs because, you know, we heard about the FISA court, we heard about how the telecom organizations were feeding data in there, and one of the things that happened shortly after the Snowden revelations is that the telecom organizations stopped feeding data into it, okay, because they didn't want to be associated with it. And as good as the data collection programs are by the US government, they depend on being fed by private industry, okay? And when those spigots get turned off, the amount of data they have, you know, basically becomes smaller, okay? So they have not only lost trust, but their programs have been damaged. We also talked about, you know, the fact that there really aren't enough people to fill the need. And if you look at this pipeline, the problem is that there aren't enough students entering IT and cybersecurity. So if you want to solve this problem, you know, you got to start earlier, right? So solving this problem, as you're going to see, is not unlike what happened during, you know, the moonshot approach that the United States took under JFK's Apollo mission. So none of you were born then, or maybe some of you were, but you may remember from your history books that Russia leapfrogged the United States, and you know, they had a satellite up there, there's this race to the moon, and JFK essentially created a moonshot approach, and you know, that required aligning our resources. Now, the United States has extremely powerful resources, right? We have, you know, just an amazing collection of people that work for the US government, some of the smartest people in the world. It could be that some of you will eventually go work there and you'll learn that firsthand. We also have tremendous resources in the industry, but we also have incredible universities and colleges and places of study, right? So if you can somehow align all those resources into one common thread, it's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to compete with the United States. But you see, this is where the polarization has really affected the United States. Because if you want to prevent the U.S. from doing it, then what you'll do is you'll get everybody upset with each other, you'll create a loss of trust, and then the U.S. cannot align. And that, in fact, is one of the main points that Russia is trying to make in their program. Okay, they're trying to make sure that we don't align, and it's not even clear that this current president will be able to get that alignment because working, almost enlisted into this problem is the media organizations and is Hollywood, and unfortunately, I must also say, is academia as well. So rather than kind of joining together into a force, unfortunately, the polarization is so bad that the organizations that want to align have their own reasons why they won't align. Okay, but the point is that if we don't align, we're in trouble. Okay, so. I like to call out Elon Musk as an example of this, because here you have one person in private industry that has disrupted 2 or 3 major industries by himself. I mean, it's not by himself because he's put a lot of his own personal wealth into it. He's raised a lot of money. He's found some of the top people in the industry to come work with him. But look what he's done. Okay, I mean, pretty much in a very short time, he's gotten reusable rockets in and out of space. It's something that it would have taken NASA 10 times more money and much more time to do. So, the idea here is that we need to align industry because they're working at an efficiency scale that the U.S. government does not. And there's a lot that the U.S. government can learn about the way private industry works. But then the question is, why do we need academia? I mean, hey, if we got industry, right, and we've got government working together, what do we need academia? Well, academia is not working on the 1 to 3 year challenge, okay? They're working on the challenges that are further out. They're working on things like, quantum computing, qubits, nanotechnology. These are things that, we're only starting now to get a taste of, but really is not going to emerge, for a little while. And they need to be working on the future problems while the industry is working on the current problems together with the government, okay? So who can fix this? Well, I like to point to Israel very often because many countries have tried to replicate what Israel does. They try to replicate their success, and one thing that Israel does is they have alignment basically between their own industries, between their academic institutions, and between the government. It's very easy to do when you're small, okay? But the other thing Israel really, has is if they're not being united under the leader, they're being united because of their enemies, okay? So nobody has any sort of question about what might happen to Israel if they pull down their defenses. Everybody knows what will happen, okay? So it's pretty easy to say that if it's not the president or, it's not the leader of Israel that's aligning Israel, it's the enemies. And, one of the issues in America is that we just don't seem to get it. I mean, we don't, people on the street, if you stop them and you ask them, like, what's the greatest threat to America? They're going to say something that may not actually be true, or they'll say something that is true but maybe is not a significant priority. And so cybersecurity must become a priority, okay? So just a couple of things here about disruptive technologies impacting cybersecurity. So one thing that is clear since the Industrial Revolution is the impact of automation, okay? Now, automation involves all kinds of things, but the bottom line is that as we start to integrate automation into the things that we've done manually, it will open the doors to a lot of other things, but at the same time it will free up our manual resources from doing things that maybe they shouldn't do or maybe they don't have to do, right? So in the United States, as the Industrial Revolution broke, the first thing to go was slavery, okay? Very interesting. Without the Industrial Revolution, it's pretty clear in my mind, at least, that we wouldn't have been able to eliminate slavery, okay? Because countries up until then simply couldn't do the things that they needed to do, unfortunately, without manipulating people in the population, getting them to work for them, essentially for free or at least for housing and food, right? So automation obviated the need, for slavery. And even though supposedly we got rid of slavery, if you take a look around, and you ask people, do you feel like a slave? More often than not, they'll say, yeah, I'm a slave to my paycheck. I'm one check away from being on the street. You know, I'm a slave to my bills, I'm a slave to whatever, okay? And the real question is, what is automation going to do? Now you have a group of people saying, I might lose my job tomorrow because I'm a truck driver or I'm a cab driver, and you know, automation may take away that job. But the reality is that as automation kind of gets its way in, if we educate the population, then we will elevate them to a new place whereby they will look at their old job as almost, you know, a slavery thing. Like, what am I doing driving around this car if it can do it on its own? So becoming, you know, intellectual property creators, and, you know, utilizing our brains in a way that, you know, only we can do as humans is kind of where we're moving to. And, you know, nanotechnology, which I don't have up on the board here, you know, there's only very few people that become millionaires or billionaires. But what do they do with that? Well, they can buy anything they want, right? But come nanotechnology kind of can create anything we want. So without funds, we can get to the same goals. And as nanotechnology disrupts, you know, kind of the next generation of people, you know, it's almost going to make us all like we're millionaires and billionaires. So in other words, the only thing really left to do, you know, is to kind of escalate the thinking process and use our brains and take us to the next phase of wherever humanity is going, okay? So that's automation. Now, the other thing I want to talk about automation is that our attackers are using automation against us. So if you're not using automation to defend yourself, it's kind of like bringing, you know, a knife to a gunfight. There's just no way to compete with that. You might have entire armies of attackers that are nothing but bots, and you're 1 or 2 people, maybe you're 20 people in the case of RSA. They had 20 people on the defense team, you know, trying to combat 120 people in China, and each of those 120 people had an arsenal of automation tools. There's just no way to fight that battle, okay? So automation is also very important in cybersecurity. And if you guys go to the school, you know, we might do a session on how IDT, you know, is leveraging automation in our cybersecurity defenses. The other one is quantum computing, and one of the first applications in quantum computing is breaking encryption. So all of the tools that, you know, we kind of use today leverage some mathematical formulation, you know, that has a finite set of key sizes. And we make the key size large enough so that, you know, current computing, both general purpose computing, merchant silicon, but also FPGAs and some of the specific, you know, uniquely designed processors, including, you know, graphics processors, you know, would take 1,000 years or so, or 100 years or so to kind of break the keys, right? But comes quantum computing and it changes that by, you know, a whole other order of magnitude. So what might take one computer 30,000 years to do, or 30,000 computers 1 year to do, can now be done in a much smaller time frame, okay? And that is sort of the promise of quantum computing. So organizations like Google have already started to think about what do they need to do to increase their key size prior to the time that general purpose quantum computing really hits, okay? So aside from breaking encryption, there's also AI and deep learning. So AI has been kind of in the minds of computer scientists for decades, okay? But really only recently has it made any sort of foray. You know, now we like to talk a lot about deep learning, but almost everything we use today, you know, if we talk about IoT, right, the Internet of Things, we've got these cameras, okay, so they're applying computer vision, they're applying all kinds of capabilities, but behind the scenes, there's some deep learning and AI going on, okay? And deep learning and AI are also the things that are going to be helping us to drive, right? When we sit in the next generation Uber or Tesla vehicle and it is taking over for us, it is leveraging that capability. And just think of what might happen if we merge quantum computing and AI, okay? So to really understand what that means, I would refer you to some of the science fiction writing you know, that has been documented, you know, by numerous authors. One of my favorite, of course, is Isaac Asimov. But in addition to the creation of these technologies, we also really need to think about where does the intersection of morality come into this, because a computer isn't a moral thing, right? it basically takes a set of instructions and executes against it. And as computers and AI become smarter, we need to start to think about what does integrating morality into that platform look like. And if you don't think that's around the corner, just think about the Tesla that people are driving. Okay, so you get into a Tesla, right? Now the Tesla is self-driving, fully autonomous, right? Now what happens if it knows it's going to get into an accident? And it has a choice. It can kill the people on the right, or it can kill the people on the left, or maybe it can save the driver, but in the process it has to kill the people on the right or the left. This is a moral question, okay? And it's something that we need to start to think about now, all right? So anyhow, I don't want to get sidetracked, but the point of the matter is that, we really need to think about what the future is. And we can't do that unless we have people thinking about it, okay? And to get people to think about it, we got to have people entering the field. So that's kind of this one presentation. I'd be happy to take questions, but there's something else I'd like to talk about. So, the floor is yours if you want to ask some questions. Yeah, go ahead.
Israel, you mentioned Israel. Israel is leading not just in cybersecurity, they're leading by cybersecurity by a ton. Per capita, they have the largest concentrated area of companies that have actual cybersecurity deals. The next is America at 62%, but per capita, Israel is by far the leader. But they're also leading, you mentioned that the alignment because they have a common enemy. That's what makes them.
It's one of the things.
Right.
Yeah.
So my question is, isn't it simplifying it? Because if you take into consideration that they're also leading in agriculture, they're also leading.
Okay, so I know what you're asking.
Yeah.
And, there have been books written about this, okay? In fact, almost every country on this planet has studied Israel's success. And they're trying to quantify it and boil it down and create a reductionary view of what it is that makes Israel successful. And the reality is that there's nothing on the physical planet that will explain it, okay? So how do you articulate that in language? You can talk about God, you can talk about spirit, okay? And to really answer that question, we have to talk about something that we don't often talk about in books, and we don't even understand ourselves, okay? So we don't know exactly what to write about it, but I like to refer to the merge of sort of quantum mechanics, right, and the mystical sciences of the Torah. And I think that until these two things come together in a cohesive way, it's going to be very difficult to choose words to articulate what's going on. But when scientists discovered the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, for example, all of a sudden they couldn't explain things easily, okay? And so I don't think there's a simple way to explain Israel's success. I really don't. So we can take that offline. But one thing I will say is that it's not only Israel that's been successful, okay? Russia has been successful, the United States has been successful. So you don't need to be Israel to be successful. But you're absolutely right that, by and large, 25% of all R&D spending today in cybersecurity is being done in Israel, and there's a reason for it. There's a reason that Intel is there. There's a reason that, every single major corporation around the United States is trying to either create laboratories or hire people in Israel. You may be able to explain it by the fact that, sort of the culture is a culture by which if we don't do A, B, and C, we will die, okay? That creates a whole army of people that are not laissez-faire about, sort of the conditions. When they leave the army, they still consider it a life and death situation, okay? So trying to instill that sense of operative fear, it's not fear to the point where we can't think, but it's the reality of the situation that unless we kind of continue to develop these technologies, we're not going to survive. That's definitely part of it. I don't have an answer for you, but I will say that Israel absolutely is an anomaly, okay? Any other questions? Okay.
How does Michael Hayden actually subscribe to what you're pointing to?
Most of it. Now, the thing about this is that there are things that people say publicly, as you know, and there are things that people say privately. So publicly, he kind of said, China's a friend, Iran is a friend, the joint plan to keep sort of Iran out of nuclearization was the right thing to do. But then when you bring up things in private, all of a sudden, it's not exactly that, Okay, so I don't know if I've answered your question, but he's a realist at the end of the day, okay, and a politician.
I mean, I used to work for him. I mean,
Yeah, so you know, okay. All right, so I thought maybe we could have a little fun. Now, I'm not actually going to demo this because I don't know the legality of it. But I wanted to kind of talk about our current cybersecurity challenges in practice, okay? Now, I had an opportunity to talk about this particular challenge to an illustrious group of people, which included members of the US government, and it included some of the biggest defense contractors, and included some of the biggest platform developers in the same category as Apple, Google, and Microsoft, okay? And I came to bring people around to talk about IoT security, and I'm gonna play just a little video for you, which I'd like you to hear. If I can get this done right, it will work. Okay, and this gives me a chance to take a break for a minute. Okay, let's see if this works. The issue is that we're all spending a lot of time focused on our routers and our switches. We're investing money in cloud security, and we're entirely missing the boat on IoT security. And here's the problem. There probably isn't a company on this planet that is not vulnerable to IoT security problems. My name is Golan Ben-Oni. I'm the Global Chief Information Officer for IDT. IDT is in a number of vertical markets. We are in the traditional telecommunications market, but we're also in the banking and finance. We're in the gas and oil market. We play in the entertainment market as well. We recently bought a pharmaceutical company, and we also are involved in education. So we are in many vertical markets, and each of those vertical markets, quite honestly, come with their own threat exposure, threat landscape. We've really had to develop and look for the latest generation of hot security startups, and that's really where we met the Armis team. It's not so much what I saw, but what I thought I'd see once I brought Armis in. And anytime you bring in a light to a dark place, it will illuminate a lot of snakes. We engaged with Armis, and it was a short time later that we went into a full POC. And exactly what I was worried about we found, that IoT devices were being misused, that we had highly insecure IoT devices in the environment, and that in fact we ran the extreme risk of compromise. Like many organizations, we like to post data on big TV screens, kind of providing stats on how many new users we have, signups, how many website visits, and it was the IoT security of these TVs actually that were vulnerable. And through the TVs themselves, actually it was possible to gain access to the internal corporate network. This is a $20 device. It is effectively a full computer. So essentially someone can take a device like this, put Linux on it, pop a battery on the bottom, and visit you as a guest, stick it under your table. And from there, basically can run complete surveillance of your entire organization. And if you find a vulnerable Bluetooth keyboard or mouse or other device, you can inject commands into that stream and basically take those computers over. This is so scary that it doesn't actually need to enter your environment. Because wireless is wireless, you can actually do a lot of damage from a kilometer away. Quite frankly, Armis is the only company I know that can look at these attack vectors today. Okay, so the reason I bring this up is, it's very important to understand how disruptive technologies can change the cybersecurity landscape. There have been other disruptive technologies, but IoT is here to stay. You may not even realize it, but you may have as many as 15, 20, or 30 IoT devices in your house. The smart doorbells you're putting on, the smart cameras that you're bringing in, the coffee machines that are brewing your coffee at 6 a.m. All of these are IoT devices, and virtually none of them have been created with security in mind, okay? IoT is a large category of equipment. It's basically the other category, but the other category is the majority, okay? And this, in fact, is the device. This device was created and designed by one of the product creators of Apple Computer, actually the individual who created most of the Macintosh original hardware designs. And he's doing some cool stuff again, okay? And this was actually designed really as a controller for anything you want. You know, you want to build a drone, you want to build a system to control climate in your environment. You know, it's just a Linux platform with a bunch of really cool modules that you can add on. And it really only is $20. And I've used these devices, in fact, to teach coding to underprivileged youth who can't afford computers, right? So for literally $20 plus, you know, another few dollars for keyboard and mouse, and maybe another $20 for a low-end screen, you know, a child can you know, for $50 or $60 get a computer that I would have dreamed of having as a child. And these are powerful, okay? But beyond being powerful computers, you know, they can be leveraged, you know, for cybersecurity. And when I gathered together this illustrious group, I demoed this, okay? And, you know, one of the famous attack methodologies, which is the cyber kill chain, let's just say that that organization was in the room. And he got up and said, "Did you just defeat my cyber kill chain?" And this is the point I'm trying to make here, which is that we have very clear defined sort of roles and responsibilities and pragmatic approaches when it comes to cybersecurity, but then something can come along and completely disrupt the whole thing. So maybe there aren't actually 7 steps in a cyber kill chain. Maybe there are 4, maybe there are 2. But the point is that every time technology changes, it's a new avenue for, you know, for attack, okay? Cloud security is a big one, right? A lot of organizations are being told by senior management, it's time to move into the cloud, but all of a sudden they're finding themselves in a new environment with different tools and different modes of operating, and it's like playing on a chessboard that's constantly changing, okay? All of a sudden, there was this queen, but now there's this other thing that can do all these other moves that they didn't know about, and you know, the reason is because if you just look at one cloud security company, which is Amazon, they're the biggest right now, they've invested $25 billion in R&D in 1 year, okay? And they are adding 5, 6 to 10 features a day, okay? That's just mind-boggling, a day. So that means that the thing that you've bought today is not the same thing you're using tomorrow, okay? And all of the features and capabilities of this thing are growing in scope. So trying to keep that thing secure ain't so easy. And you know, again, that's the reason that organizations that have dumped tens of millions of dollars a year or more into cyber programs are finding themselves constantly embarrassed. And it's because this disruption is constantly changing the playing field, okay? And that is only going to improve the chances that someone who enters a cybersecurity field will get employment somewhere, okay? And that's just the reality. Okay, so that was the other thing I want to say. Go ahead.
Do you have any thoughts on like the state of blockchain-based startups that are trying to address issues with IoT?
So, you know, blockchain is a very interesting technology. I think that it will play a very critical role. On the other hand, I think that blockchain is also being overused and touted. You know, just assigning the word blockchain to any project that you might be working on suddenly gives it a greater visibility. I mean, we learned this too.
Quantum computing blockchain, you've got a double.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Long Island Ice Tea raised up their stocks by calling them
We did
Long
too.
Island, blocks.
IDT did too. We announced, you know, that we're going to be doing, you know, blockchain technology, and all of a sudden our stock shot up by 20%. So, you know, it's true, and we didn't do anything. We just mentioned it. Yeah. Any other questions?
Can you give a specific example of how that device might be used to?
Well, I just did.
Well,
But the real question is, you know, I'm not going to demo it because I don't want you guys. The problem is that this problem hasn't been solved. Okay. And you know, although I didn't try it against other organizations, I know I'll be successful. But that's really what, you know, what I do. Okay, so you know, I'm looking for potential entrance ways into our organization, but I realize that there aren't vendors out there to solve that. So part of what I do is I spend time with startups. Okay, so Armis is an example of that. So when the people who just left Microsoft got together and said, we want to start a new company, what do you think we should do? You know, I was like, it's pretty simple. You know, let's create an IoT, you know, company that will solve the IoT challenges. Okay. So Armis is addressing that. And one thing that Armis does is effectively it will give you a visibility. Okay, so this is the way cyber works. If you want to break into something, you need to know what you're breaking into, or you're trying to defend something, you need to know what you're defending against. So it creates an inventory of IoT systems. And then it creates sort of, it's an analytical platform that looks to see, you know, how IoT systems are being used in your environment. So it's not uncommon, for example, for there to be a boardroom or conference room like this, right? You've got Google Hangouts running, you've got this OWL device, okay, that's got machine vision built into it, and it's streaming to the internet. Well, it shouldn't be on unless you turn it on, but like, what if it's always on, okay? You know, what if it's in your boardroom and it's not supposed to be on and it's on? How would you know that, okay? So this is another thing that you know, we try to look for in IoT security is, what's the behavior of these devices? What are they communicating with? What networks are they attached to? Are they bridging networks they shouldn't be? Are they bridging, for example, you know, the public Wi-Fi that you give to guests with the corporate network, okay? You know, has a guest walked in with a MiFi connection, 4G, and is suddenly transmitting a ton of data from your corporate devices to that, okay? You would want to know about that, right? Because it might be doing traffic interception, it might be injecting, you know, certificates that you shouldn't be approving, but everybody approves anyway, and then decrypting traffic. You know, I could talk about this for hours, but the point is that, you know, virtually nobody is doing anything about it. And so again, part of my role is to either work with vendors to, you know, increase the efficacy and visibility and operations and automation of their product, or go create them. You know, and there's no shortage of vendors that are trying to solve problems. There's also no shortage of vendors that are trying not to solve problems, but just to make money. You know, I think that this is going to be this Theranos year of cybersecurity. I think that some of the very big cyber companies that are basically selling snake oil are going to get called on it, okay? It's about time that happens, because they're making it very difficult for the purchasers and the CIOs and CISOs to do their job, because there's so much noise out there, okay? Go ahead.
Can you give an example of some security programs that consumers use that are snake oil, like common programs?
Well, I don't want to call anyone under the bus, but let's just say that the vast majority are, okay? That you know, that there's, and the reason isn't because they weren't doing something good before. The reason is that it's entirely irrelevant today, okay? So like antivirus, useless, okay? It's completely useless technology because it was built on, you know, sort of this concept of, we know what we're looking for and we're going to tell you when we find it. It's useless because we don't know what we're looking for, and therefore signature-based detection's dead, okay? That's an example. Now, is McAfee and Symantec and all these companies snake oil? They didn't mean to be, but you know, their products today just simply aren't doing what they need to do.
I'd argue that McAfee in particular does know exactly what their issue is.
Well, they all do. They all do, but the question is, how
No, I think-
how quickly can they pivot, right?
Well, they could have a Kodak moment, right, where Kodak knew that electronic photography was gonna take over, and it couldn't get out of the silver business.
Yeah. I mean, Kodak had a blockchain moment too, by the way. You know, just 6 or 7 months ago, they announced something. I have no idea what they're doing, but you know, they're trying to pivot into blockchain. So, you know, so maybe something will come out of Kodak that I'm not expecting. But yeah, I mean, look, it's very hard for organizations that have a waterfall development process where they take 6-9 months with product management and product owners.
An investor ecosystem who won't let them pivot on certain cases.
That's true. Unfortunately, there's a very big company that I like a lot that is the leader in the Gartner Magic Quadrant. This is something that you will learn about. So there are organizations that supposedly, you know, make intelligent decisions about who's the leading company in cybersecurity. And it's a company called Gartner Research. Okay, they do a lot of research about this. Well, they're dead wrong. Okay. And the company that they have on the upper right quadrant is actually in a lot of danger right now as it relates to their space, which is, you know, the SIM space, or the security information event monitoring space. And you know, it's just the reality. This company is an organization that has told the street that this is how we're going to make money, and they cannot pivot because of that. You know, their methodology of making money is basically by charging for ingest of data. So every bit that you ingest costs X. And then, you know, there's this thing called open source. Maybe you've heard about it. There's no costs, okay? There's no licensing costs for that. The cost is simply in the combination of computing and storage and I/O resources, okay? And so it's very hard for a large organization like that to compete with open source. And they've been counting on the fact that open source just can't get their act together, which might be true. But there's a whole next generation of companies that are utilizing open source in a very smart way and will be competing with them. So, yeah.
So from what I understand, there's this whole millions or billions of devices on the IoT and computers and phones that have subpar security too. So how do you convert devices that weren't built with security
You get rid of
to
them.
be secure?
You get rid of them. Okay, so let me give you an example. So the hospitals have this problem. And actually they have a unique problem because unlike an enterprise organization where I can just throw this Mac out if I don't want it, they can't necessarily do that with their medical devices, right? Their pumps and sort of all the, so they heavily rely on the vendor community. And the vendor community hasn't even started thinking about cybersecurity, right? So you can't even bolt on security if you want to. Let's say you have a solution that will secure some of these medical devices. Guess what? If you put it on that medical device and someone dies, all right, that's your problem. Because the vendor will say that if you modify this in any way, we no longer have responsibility for it, okay? But yet there aren't any vendors that are supplying, you know, so for example, pacemakers. I mean, just in the last couple months, you know, there's this pacemaker company that's suddenly providing all these firmware upgrades because, you know, like you can walk around and kill people if you know what you're doing by, you know, stopping the heart, okay? The reality is, though, that, you know, medical devices is probably going to be the most covered because if it isn't done right, people will die. That's kind of like the news likes to talk about that. I mean, the reality with pacemakers is that if you wanted to kill someone with a pacemaker, you don't need to hack into it. You just need a high energy beam, right? I mean, you may remember that, like, in all the rooms where microwaves used to be, there'd be a big warning sign about people not entering the kitchen while the microwave is on who might have pacemakers, right? But the point that I'm trying to make is that the medical device community really needs to focus on this, okay? And it's not just about theft of PII. That's another issue, right? So like this Apple Watch, I mean, you have no idea how much it's collecting about me, okay? It knows my sleeping patterns, you know, it knows how much I'm moving, it knows where I am, it knows whether I've got a heart problem, okay? So just imagine if that data got into the hands of an insurance company, right? They may choose not to cover me. You know, an insurance company might buy that surreptitiously for $1 a record so they know who not to insure because in a year from now they might have to spend $250,000 on surgery for this guy, okay? So in other words, PII is very, very sensitive, and especially the PII around medical devices, and not only because if they're manipulated they could kill somebody, but because, you know, it's really the best place to get information about somebody. And if it's not the watch, it's your mobile phone, right? I mean, think about it. It's got video technology, audio technology, you carry it around everywhere you go, it's got a network connection. So if you wanted to spy on somebody, you break into their mobile phone and there's almost nothing that you can't learn about them, right? Go ahead.
So do you think that the HIPAA compliance model is outdated and needs to be updated?
Well, I mean, let's not talk about HIPAA for a minute. Let's talk about GDPR because, you know, GDPR is foremost in the minds. And so the Europeans have always had a far more advanced, you know, methodology in terms of what to do from a policy and compliance perspective. They are sort of worlds ahead of the United States in one way. But then you look at what they did with GDPR and you kind of scratch your head, okay? So one thing that they did with GDPR is they said that we'll come and we'll take 30% of your revenue if you screw up, or something like that, okay? We're not even talking about profits, and that's worldwide. So almost out the gate, day one, Google and Facebook were hit with $8.8 billion fines, okay? Now just think about that for a minute. So if you're an organization doing business in Europe and you just saw two large, well-respected organizations get hit with an $8 billion fine, and you know they've got tons of fine people that are working on the problem, what are you gonna do? Maybe you won't go into business, okay? So in other words, you don't want to create a situation where it is difficult to do business. You want to create a situation where there's policies you can deploy that aren't impossible to affect, but it's certainly the case that what Facebook got away with, should never have happened. And I'm not even sure what the right way to address that is. It's going to be a combination of policy and compliance and fines, right, and training and software and systems and all these things, right? I don't have an answer to that, but I do know that if you look at what Trump has done, one of the first things he did when he got into office was he changed the corporate tax rate, right? So all these like big fat corporate organizations with tons of money were sheltering it overseas because they didn't want to be taxed. Well, now it's all flooding back in the United States because the corporate tax rate has been lowered. And I think that was a brilliant move because it's going to create all kinds of interesting opportunities here. But Europe is doing the opposite. They're making it even more difficult to do business. So I think that that's going to cement the United States' dominance, okay? And I think it will really help our country. But I just don't know what the Europeans are going to do about GDPR. Yeah.
So there are going to be there's just going to continue to be all sorts of data breaches and stuff until a whole generation of devices is overhauled? And
well, unfortunately, I think the answer to this is someone's going to have to die, before people start taking this seriously. It's just the reality.
People have already died. Somebody needs to die in a spectacular way.
Yeah, I mean, or hopefully not. Hopefully not. I really hope people don't die because that's not the right way. That's not the right way to solve it. And in fact, if you look at the way boards have handled cybersecurity, they have now sort of realized the importance of cybersecurity, and they've demanded that sort of the chief czar of risk. Some call him a chief risk officer, some call him a chief security officer, but they sort of have direct board reporting. Whether or not they work for the CEO or someone else. So, in other words, their effectiveness is directly responsible for the effectiveness of the security of the organization, and they need to be given funding and they need to be given tools and resources to do their jobs. And that's going to start the process of changing, the behavior of organizations and the behavior of organizations that create the products that we use. Yeah. Go ahead.
So, like, from like a white hat standpoint, would you say that would you weigh in on the ethics of like publishing some kind of like 0-day expert?
Okay, so sure. I mean, look, 2 weeks ago I found a bug in Apple iOS, and I could have done anything with it. Okay, I could have gone to the U.S. government and sold it to them. I could have gone to the Chinese government and sold it to them, right? So that would be a question of ethics.
Right.
Even giving it to my own country is a question of ethics.
But I'm saying you sort of painted a picture where we're so far behind on IoT security.
Yeah, but it's not only IoT. Okay, IoT is just another problem. But I want to talk about this for a minute because, there is this thing called bug bounty programs. And basically the idea behind a bug bounty program is that you get credited for the things that you find. Okay, you get paid, whatever it is. And they have whole like price sheets that you can pull up. So like Google has one and Apple has one, they all have them. And depending on the severity of the issue you find, if you report it in the right way, then you're eligible, for gaining payment. And doing it in the right way means that you don't tell everybody how you did it, okay? You give them an opportunity to fix it, and then enough time goes by for them to be able to apply the patches out into their environment so that by the time it does go into public disclosure, the amount of damage would be limited.
Today, as far as mobile phones go, it's not even a matter of hacking or how secure the phone is. All you need to do is create an application that someone wants and then request all the permissions where the vast majority of people don't.
Okay, so that's going to change. So basically, in cybersecurity platforms, in platforms like mobile phones, you have, let's say, enclaves, okay? And you have something called a secure enclave. And within a secure enclave, the data that moves between one enclave and another is supposed to be restricted, but then you have this thing called a user that just approves everything. Okay, that's a problem. So you can go way out of your way to make sure you have a secure enclave, and then you have a simple request, and let's say this app won't run unless you approve it. And this is another thing that users need to be trained. And something else, they'll never get trained. No matter how much training you have, if a user is really trying to open up ways because they're trying to get to a certain destination, and all of a sudden one day Waze says, oh, approve this, they're not even going to think about it. They're not going to remember it, okay? But let's say for a minute that Waze is not asking for things they shouldn't know about. But is the Waze development platform secure, right? So this is another thing that China has done, is they've taken a look at the top apps in the App Store, and they went and attacked their development libraries, okay? So they've compiled into the development libraries to get linked automatically and uploaded into the cloud certain capabilities that weren't there before, okay? And through that, they've managed to basically read a lot of keystrokes, and all kinds of terrible things have happened. And it's very hard to deal with, because when you are a platform with an app store and there are 20,000 new apps being added, are you going through source code trees? No. Are you looking at it statically? Maybe. But it's very hard to, it's sort of very hard to audit these things, okay? And so the pace of innovation has definitely outstripped the pace of detection, okay? And that's the reason that we're in the situation that we're in now.
So is there an answer to that, the pace?
There's an answer, sure, but there's no silver bullet, okay? So if you want to say, I'm going to slow down all the apps that go into the App Store by 2 weeks while we do a $50,000 audit, and every single free app is going to have to go through a $50,000 audit every 2 weeks, is that an answer? Not really.
How about
Okay.
don't allow an app to ask for permissions that it doesn't need to run that
But
app?
how do you
I
know?
know.
Okay, so let me give you an example. Waze just recently, a year or so ago, added health statistics. Like, why would Waze need health statistics? Well, it turns out that it wants to know where it is, so that if you park your car, okay, it will tell you, like, I forgot where I parked my car. It would be nice to know if Waze reminded me where I parked the car. Well, it uses the health statistics on your watch to know that you just got up out of your seat and you're now walking around, so you probably just parked your car, okay? So in other words, like, if you didn't know that, like when I saw that permission request, I tweeted to Waze, and I said, what is this for exactly? And that's the answer they gave me. So it makes sense, but now you have all their users approving it, okay? And that's a potential another data leakage for all kinds of data.
I just wanted to add, I've
Yeah.
seen that happen, and I don't have the watch, and it uses the phone for that.
Correct.
Would you say one app store is better than the other in terms of security?
Apps?
One app store, Google Play or compared to the app store?
Oh, so you're asking me Apple versus Google?
In
It
terms
doesn't
of-
matter.
in terms of security.
They have the same problem. Okay. So, like,
There's no one more
so
open
Tim
source
Cook
than
will tell you, of course, it's Apple, and Eric Schmidt will tell you, of course, it's Google, but they're both wrong. They both have the same problems. And, when the FBI said that they've got 9,000 cases that they can't crack because they can't get access to the information, they started an internal program that I believe they spent about $15 million to try and crack, the security of the iPhone. And then some company somewhere, there was an Israeli one, but there were two others that figured out how to crack the iPhone, and they started selling it for $5,000, okay? So just think about that, right? And actually, just this week, Apple closed the bug. But I know there are more because I found one 2 weeks ago. Okay, go ahead.
What are you doing with that button?
Well, so, yes, I actually know Apple very well, and I'm not the sort of person that needs any notoriety in the press. I don't need my name associated with a CVE. I'd actually prefer not to, for the same reason that our colleague here doesn't want to get targeted. If you are sort of in cybersecurity, you do need some notoriety, but not necessarily with everything you do, okay? And so I have a special relationship with Apple. It's happened at least once a year for the last 5 years that I've found something of interest to them, and, we didn't do it publicly, okay?
I think initially from what you said from the cybersecurity, from the beginning of the presentation, that no matter how we try to solve the problem, there are still going to be the loophole at the end of the
We're still going to be.
The loophole. I mean, we're still going to face another
Yeah,
issue.
because these products are created by people, and people aren't perfect. So we'll never get to the point where things
So,
are perfect.
based on the IoT devices we are using these days now, so how are we going to depend on their information? I mean, the statistics. I mean, how we derive the information on them, and how accurate the information we get from them? How can we depend on it?
Well, you could ask that question about our press, right? Here you have an old system that doesn't even use technology, and you can ask that question. So what I'm trying to say is that this isn't necessarily a technological problem, okay? If you go back to its root, the problem are the people behind the scenes. And the real question you're asking is, how can we trust our friends and colleagues around us, okay? And that's an age-old question that we've been asking since the dawn of civilization. And it's just that the technology has distracted us for a minute from the real question, okay? But technology has also made it complicated. It hasn't made it easier, all right? You know, and voting systems, right? So I talked to one of the chief cryptographers in the United States, Bruce Schneier, you know, about this issue, and we can on paper construct a system that is indefeatable. But, you know, when it comes time to actually deploying it, there are all kinds of problems, and there, you know, there's a conference in Las Vegas called Black Hat, and they took some of these voting machines that supposedly were impenetrable, and they literally, like, overnight defeated them. So what I'm trying to say is that they figured out a way to make the voting machine lie, okay? And this was a voting machine that, as far as the people that made it knew, was impenetrable. So people will always find a loophole, and that's one of the beauties of open source. You know, there is no security in obscurity. So in other words, you want to kind of talk about how you're doing things. You want people to audit what you're doing, because if you don't, people are going to find out a hole and they're not going to tell you, and then they're going to use it against you at some point. So that's the best chance we have.
When you say that you find all these bugs in iOS, is that like something you look for?
No,
iOS? Like,
no. So let me put it to you this way,
bugs?
okay? It's something I could do, is look for things, but when you're involved in cybersecurity, you will find them anyway, okay? I mean, this particular one, I just found on my way to bed. I wasn't even looking for it, okay? It just came up and I realized it wasn't acting right. So then I went back to my table and I worked on it for a couple more hours, and that's when I realized it was a serious issue, and I got to bed at 2 in the morning. But that's, you know, that's kind of,
looking for problems.
I'm not necessarily looking for them, but when you're in a role, a cyber role, you'll see problems emerge. And in fact, you know, last year, that's exactly what happened again, you know, because I detected both Russia and China using the NSA exploit tools against a contractor here, okay? And, you know, as part of that analysis, I did, and by the way, I didn't do it in isolation. I brought over 107 researchers on with me to look at this. Researchers from Google and Microsoft and, you know, some of the major organizations to look at what I saw. And we all concluded, you know, that basically we're screwed because there's no vendor out there to protect against it right now, okay? And that's kind of the state. I wasn't looking for it, it just emerged. In fact, I was out here helping the city of Newark. They just were hit with ransomware. The whole city was down. The only system that wasn't down was the payroll machine because it was so old. It was running Windows 2000. It couldn't even get infected by ransomware. But every single system was down, okay? And I was there pro bono trying to help them up, and my SOC called me and said, we just got hit with ransomware, and I thought they were wrong. And then when I looked at it, and I looked at a system that we used, you know, so we had 5 endpoint EPPs, endpoint protection software packages, deployed on the machine. This is something that the NSA told me I should do, which is that you can't rely on one company, so put in 3, so I put in 5, okay? And then one of them, basically all it does is visibility. So it doesn't actually do anything, but it records everything. And so I was able to look to see actually how that system got compromised. A very interesting story. But the conclusion that I made was that something bad is out in the wild, and if we don't do something about it, the world is going to be taken down. And then WannaCry hit, and then Petya and not Petya went out, and, you know, the Ukraine power systems went down. It was all the same TPPs that we saw here at IDT, and I wasn't looking for it, trust me. Go ahead.
So as of right now, we basically, like on a personal level, we kind of just have to hope nobody tries to attack us because there's really not much we can do.
Well, hope doesn't help either.
It depends on whether you think you're being targeted by a state actor.
Well, you don't have to be, and this is the point I'm trying to make, is that it used to be, that being attacked by a state actor is like the worst, but the problem is that the state actor's tools have leaked. So now you don't know if you're dealing with a state actor or a 15-year-old, okay? That's the problem. And that's exactly what Tim Cook was saying, which is that we should not defeat the encryption processes in our devices, not because we don't trust the governments that we're giving access to, but because we don't know who else is behind them, okay?
Would it have helped if the city of Newark had been relying less completely on just Windows and also had, let's say, some Linux machines?
For now, but because Windows has a massive attack surface, and if they went to a system with a smaller attack surface, the risk would be lower, but it's not zero. Okay.
Right, but it would have.
But they were hit with commodity malware, which meant that no one was trying to attack them. It's just that they were doing such a poor job of hygiene that eventually they got athlete's foot. Okay, and that's kind of what
I
happened.
guess Linux can't really help in that area.
No.
I'm just curious if you found a way to help them with that once they were attacked.
Sure. So
Higher security people.
Okay, so in this particular case, an interesting use case, because I was talking to so many people about it. The first people I talked to, of course, were the CEOs of the cybersecurity companies that failed, right? So individually, they came to me with their chief scientists and head of development and said, it's going to take us 3 to 6 months to fix. So I'm not waiting 3 or 6 months. So that's when I call Israel, and I talked to 2 vendors in Israel saying, fix it. One of them actually kicked me a version of code 2 days later that I deployed across my entire organization and solved against that problem. So, like this is another reason that I deal with startups, because, they are rapid deployment, continuous development, different way of creating products. They rely on Scrum teams, and they can actually pivot like twice a day if they have to.
But my question was more, were you able to recover that? Just a particular interest in it, if you were able to recover the encrypted data.
Well, I mean, we back everything up. So let me just be clear. This wasn't about ransomware. Okay, ransomware was a smokescreen. Ransomware was supposed to be the thing that I looked at that said, right? But because I had an EDR running, I knew that ransomware was the final stage of this attack, and that actually what they were after were credentials. So I saw them steal the credentials in memory, I saw them steal the credentials on disk, I saw them steal the credentials from the browsers, and then I saw them attempt to move left and right or laterally in the organization. We were fortunate enough that we nipped that thing in the bud. But when they weren't able to move laterally, then they ran the ransomware, okay? So had I not had that visibility, I would have just thought we had a development resource that got ransomware, but this had nothing to do with ransomware.
So this was specific to IDT?
It was specific, it was a targeted attack, that's correct.
Right.
And the same individual was targeted by 2 countries, okay? So you should ask the question, right? This person was important in our organization. How did 2 countries figure out that that's the person we need to attack within a few hours of each other? Right, very interesting, okay?
So much for non-collusion. Right?
So much for well, it was not collusion. She had a LinkedIn, okay, so.
One country spying on the other.
No, I honestly believe that they collected this information separately. Okay. Any other questions?
And did it within a couple of hours of each other?
Yes.
Wow. One of them is more on top of their game than the other one, I guess.
I'm sorry?
One of them is more on top of their game than the other one, I guess.
Well, they're both on top of the game.
Or that one might have penetrated the other.
Yeah, so, the Chinese actually weren't as sophisticated in this case as the Russians. The Chinese had their own ideas about what they wanted to do. The Chinese did not try to steal credentials. They were trying to do something else. The Russians were trying to steal credentials, okay? So they were actually a lot more sophisticated, but they were both using an NSA exploit tool called Eternal Blue. Only Russia was using double pulsar, which is another, so they were using double pulsar to do essentially in-memory process injection, stuff that didn't hit disk. That's why none of the EPP vendors I had worked, because they're not looking at stuff, they're not looking at in-memory process injection. But, the first stage of this attack actually had nothing to do with the machine. And the first stage of the attack compromised the cable modem. And the cable modem's access list and provisioning file was changed to allow basically public access to a machine that was supposed to have been firewalled. That was the first stage of the attack. So that's how I knew this was targeted. This is not like your average schmo doing this, okay? Any other questions? By the way, you can read about that case in the New York Times. It was on the front page. Okay. All right?
Okay, so
Good.
first of all,
I think